Modern aviation is widely regarded as the safest way to travel. Even so, history has repeatedly borne witness to tragedies that stunned the world. A single wrong decision, an overlooked technical detail, or a misunderstood radio call can turn a peaceful flight into a catastrophe that claims hundreds of lives. In today's video, we revisit 4 of the most haunting air disasters. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Story 1. Saudia Flight 163. On the 19th of August, 1980, an in-flight emergency forced Saudia Flight 163 to make an emergency landing at Riyadh International Airport. Yet, despite what appeared to be a successful touchdown, not a single soul aboard the aircraft survived. The flight was operated by a crew of 3. Captain Mohammed Kawader was a pilot with more than 7,000 flight hours, though his record suggested he was a slow learner who had required more training time than most of his peers. First Officer Sami Abdullah Hassanain was not truly proficient with this type of aircraft and had once been dismissed from flight school for poor performance before eventually securing his license. Flight engineer Bradley Curtis had failed his upgrade attempt to first officer and had been forced to pay out of his own pocket just to retain his position. Although none of the 3 carried particularly impressive resumes, each was technically qualified and had passed the necessary checks. The initial leg of the journey went smoothly. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar departed Quaid-e-Azam International Airport in Pakistan at 6:32 in the evening local time. Passengers enjoyed an uneventful flight into Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where they were scheduled for a 2-hour stopover. During this period, all passengers disembarked while the aircraft was serviced and refueled. Those continuing on to the final destination of Jeddah reboarded soon afterward. Shortly after takeoff, however, the cockpit contacted air traffic control to declare an emergency return to Riyadh, requesting that fire trucks be made ready. Controllers immediately cleared the runway. The aircraft circled back and touched down in front of waiting rescue crews. Observers assumed the jet would stop right there. Instead, it continued to slow gradually, turned onto a taxiway, and executed a precise 180-degree turn. Only then did Captain Kawader announce that he was initiating an evacuation. Rescue teams rushed to the aircraft, prepared to assist, but no passengers emerged. Smoke began seeping from the fuselage, followed swiftly by flames. Despite the best efforts of firefighters, the jet was soon engulfed. All exits remained closed, and no one managed to escape. On board were 301 people, 287 passengers, and 14 crew members. Many of those passengers had been on a pilgrimage, with entire families perishing on what was meant to be the most sacred journey of their lives. Investigators were faced with 2 pressing questions. What had ignited the fire on board? And why had the captain failed to stop immediately and evacuate upon landing? The origin of the blaze proved difficult to pinpoint. Although the inquiry could not produce a definitive conclusion, it determined that the fire had started in the aft cargo hold. The exact source was likely destroyed in the flames, but suspicion fell upon a piece of passenger luggage. Investigators discovered 2 butane camp stoves in the wreckage, though it could not be proven that they were responsible. Cockpit voice recordings revealed that once the fire began, the crew committed a series of errors. Their exchanges muddled and confused, each mistake costing them precious, irreplaceable minutes. From the very beginning, the crew recognized trouble when the smoke warning in the cargo hold was activated. Yet instead of treating it as an immediate emergency, they spent nearly 5 minutes debating. The captain seemed hesitant to make a decision and turned instead to the far less experienced flight engineer. After this exchange, Flight Engineer Curtis attempted to look up the proper checklist. Unfortunately, he consulted the wrong section of the manual. Convinced that no relevant procedure existed, Curtis then spent additional time checking the smoke detectors themselves to see if they might be faulty. In doing so, he inadvertently introduced fresh oxygen into the compartment, which only served to intensify the blaze. Moments later, he suggested returning to the passenger cabin to verify the presence of smoke firsthand. Only when Curtis came back and confirmed that there was indeed a fire on board was the decision finally made to turn back toward Riyadh. The cockpit atmosphere during the return was chaotic. Captain Kawader repeatedly asked for instructions to be repeated, unable to catch them the first time. 2 flight attendants entered in turn, reporting smoke and fire in the cabin, and later warning that passengers were panicking and crowding the aisles. At times, the voice recorder captured Captain Kawader humming a tune, while Curtis kept repeating the phrase, "Everything will be fine." Perhaps both men were trying to remain calm, but the effect only heightened the tension. In such circumstances, several critical decisions were never made. Flight attendants asked multiple times whether passengers should be evacuated immediately after landing, but the captain gave no clear answer. Precious minutes were wasted on tasks of little importance. During the emergency landing procedures, the crew lost time switching on the no smoking sign and repeating checklist items that had already been completed, while failing to prioritize the essentials. These missteps delayed the response significantly, but the gravest mistake was the captain's failure to execute a full stop and order an evacuation the moment the aircraft touched down. By this stage, the cockpit voice recorder had ceased operating. Still, after completing a precise 180-degree turn, Captain Cowder informed the tower that he was beginning evacuation. This suggested he still believed he had control of the situation. Later analysis confirmed the braking system was more than capable of bringing the aircraft to a halt much earlier, but instead he chose to decelerate gradually and taxi off the runway. Compounding the problem, the crew failed to depressurize the cabin upon landing, which left the doors impossible to open from the outside. A common theory is that the captain did not fully appreciate the severity of the fire, perhaps concerned about blocking the runway, or convinced that a more orderly evacuation could be carried out after taxiing clear. Another possibility is that by keeping the engines running while taxiing, he hoped the airflow would draw smoke out of the cabin. In practice, this did not occur. By the time evacuation was attempted, the fire had grown ferociously, and flashovers swept through the cabin almost instantly, filling it with flames and toxic smoke. The official report concluded that in less than 30 seconds, deadly fumes had spread throughout the cabin, causing the deaths of everyone on board. The crew's indecision and mishandling were harshly criticized, yet no individual was ever held accountable, for there were no survivors of Saudia Flight 163. Story 2. The crash of United Flight 232. On the 19th of July, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 departed on what was meant to be a routine journey from Stapleton International Airport in Denver to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, with a final leg to Philadelphia International Airport. Yet Flight 232 would never reach its ultimate destination. United Airlines, headquartered in the United States, had been operating continuously since 1931. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the airline was a popular choice, particularly for shorter cross-country routes. Though not the largest carrier, United remained well regarded within the industry. The aircraft assigned to operate Flight 232 that day was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, tail number N1819U. At 18 years of age, it had accumulated more than 43,401 flight hours, neither brand new nor yet at the end of its service life. The crew on board were professionals with varying levels of experience. Captain Alfred Haynes, age 57, had joined United in 1956 and logged more than 7,000 hours in the DC-10. First Officer William Records, 48 years old, had begun his career with National Airlines in 1969, later flying for Pan American, before joining United in 1985. He had roughly 600 hours of experience in the DC-10. Flight engineer Dudley Dvorak, age 51, had been hired by United in 1986 and had logged only 33 hours on the type. In addition to the cockpit crew, there were 8 flight attendants and a total of 285 passengers, many of them traveling with young children on their laps. At the time, United was running a Children's Day promotion whereby children under the age of 14 could fly with an accompanying adult for just a penny. Many families took advantage of this offer, setting out for vacation destinations at unprecedentedly low fares. At 2:09 in the afternoon, Flight 232 lifted off from Denver and climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude. The DC-10 leveled off at 37,000 feet, approximately 11,277 meters, and remained there for about 1 hour. The flight proceeded exactly as scheduled until 3:16 p.m., when a violent shudder shook the aircraft. A loud bang followed instantly. The autopilot disengaged at once, and Captain Haynes saw warning indicators showing that engine number 2 had failed. He attempted to reduce power, only to discover that the throttles were jammed. The crew managed to shut the engine down completely, but in doing so they realized the control columns no longer responded. Flight engineer Dvorak checked the systems and found that all hydraulics, the lifeblood of the aircraft's controls, had been completely depleted. Every attempt to restore them with auxiliary power failed. The DC-10 fell into a phugoid cycle, its nose pitching up and down in a wave-like motion, while simultaneously banking further and further to the right. The crew could find no checklist, no established procedure to counter the unfolding disaster. Even a desperate call to United's maintenance base yielded no solution. In a rare stroke of fortune, Denny Fitch, a 46-year-old DC-10 flight instructor, happened to be on board as a passenger. He immediately recognized the rolling oscillations the plane was experiencing. Since becoming an instructor, Fitch had studied the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which had occurred just 4 years earlier. That flight, too, had lost all hydraulics and fallen into a similar phugoid cycle before ending in tragedy. After speaking through a flight attendant, Fitch was escorted to the cockpit. There, working alongside the crew, he helped quickly determine what the aircraft could and could not do. They discovered that by modulating thrust on the remaining engines, they could at least influence the plane's heading to the right. At the same time, they could alter pitch to counteract the phugoid oscillations. Captain Haynes asked Fitch to manage the throttles so he himself could focus on the control column. Despite the life-threatening circumstances, the crew maintained composure and even relieved the tension with moments of humor. Fitch was recorded saying, "I'll tell you what, when this is all over, we'll have a beer." To which Captain Haynes replied, "I don't drink, but I'll sure as hell have one this time." Working together, they guided the crippled DC-10 towards Sioux Gateway Airport. As they did, Haynes requested that air traffic controllers keep the aircraft well clear of the city, a clear indication that, despite his calm demeanor, he fully grasped the gravity of their situation. As Flight 232 prepared to land, one final adjustment was required. Unable to align with runway 31 as planned, the crew diverted to runway 22, the very strip where fire and rescue units had gathered. Those vehicles scrambled out of the way as the DC-10 approached at a speed far beyond safe limits. Moments before touchdown, the aircraft rolled sharply to the right. The crew applied extra thrust on the port engines to counter the bank, but it was too late. The right wing struck the ground and broke away as the fuselage slammed down. The jet disintegrated, spilling fuel that ignited into a fireball. The aircraft shattered into pieces, flames consuming the wreckage. Only the cockpit and tail sections remained relatively intact, coming to rest in a cornfield adjacent to the airport. Even with fire crews already on scene, the inferno raged for more than 5 hours. The destruction was so violent that first responders doubted anyone had survived, but astonishingly, many had. 185 people lived through the disaster, though one later succumbed to injuries. Not only did numerous passengers escape, but some even re-entered the wreckage to help others. Passenger Jerry Schemmel, for example, lost a friend in the crash but managed to free himself, then went back inside the burning fuselage to rescue an 11-month-old child. Still, the tragedy claimed 112 lives. The investigation into Flight 232 was swift, yet complex. Focus fell on the number 2 engine, whose critical fan disc fragments were missing from the crash site. Manufacturer General Electric posted a reward for their recovery, and 3 months later, a farmer discovered the parts in her field. Tests revealed that the fan disc had been defective from its manufacture in 1971. The steel contained an impurity that led to gradual fatigue, eventually fracturing mid-flight. United Airlines maintenance procedures should have caught the flaw earlier, but at the time, inspections paid little attention to such cracks. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that when the disc failed, it exploded with immense force, destroying not only the engine but also damaging the tail, rear elevators, and the hydraulic systems, explaining why the crew had lost all primary control. The findings prompted sweeping changes across aviation. New aircraft designs incorporated upgraded hydraulics to prevent total loss of control, and United revised its maintenance protocols. The ordeal of Flight 232 also became a defining case study in crew resource management. Indeed, the crew worked together so effectively that when test pilots attempted to replicate the scenario in simulators, none matched or exceeded their performance. The United crew was praised for carrying out what many called an impossible landing. Captain Haynes received awards and wide recognition, though he always insisted the credit belonged equally to his colleagues, all of whom survived with serious injuries. In the years that followed, Haynes became a respected speaker on aviation safety, recounting the events of that day to audiences around the world. A memorial was later erected for those who perished. United's DC-10s remained in service for years until their retirement in 2001. Though the crash of Flight 232 cost many lives, without the extraordinary teamwork, ingenuity, and calm determination of the crew, the outcome would have been far more catastrophic. Story 3. The Story of Flight 5390. On the 10th of June, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 was en route to Spain when, without warning, 2 of the 6 cockpit windows blew out. In most circumstances, such a failure would all but guarantee catastrophe. Yet in this case, What followed became one of aviation's most extraordinary exceptions. The flight began without incident. Departing from Birmingham Airport, its destination was Malaga, Spain. The weather that day was clear. At the controls was Captain Tim Lancaster, a pilot with 11,000 hours of experience, alongside First Officer Alastair Aitchison, who had logged 7,900 hours. Although the two men had never flown together before, they quickly developed an easy coordination, lifting the aircraft into the sky without difficulty. On board were 84 passengers and 6 cabin crew, all expecting nothing more than a routine journey. Once airborne, Captain Lancaster engaged the autopilot and loosened his shoulder harness for comfort. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden entered the cockpit to take the pilot's breakfast orders, promising to return shortly with 2 cups of hot tea. Everything seemed normal, and then, disaster struck. One of the cockpit windows suddenly shattered outward, disappearing into the rushing slipstream and leaving a gaping void in its place. The sudden change in pressure was violent. The cockpit door was torn off its hinges, and Captain Lancaster was wrenched from his seat, sucked headlong toward the opening. Only his legs remained inside, trapped against the controls, while the rest of his body was flung outward and slammed against the fuselage by the roaring wind. At that moment, Ogden, still standing near the cockpit doorway, staggered inside, stunned by the explosion. What he saw was chaos. The captain suspended outside the shattered window, his legs wedged against the console, while First Officer Aitchison struggled desperately to regain control, the cockpit filled with mist and the deafening howl of rushing air. Without hesitation, Ogden lunged forward, seized Lancaster's legs, and held on with all his strength. Aitchison now faced the near-impossible task of flying under brutal conditions. The cockpit opened to the sky, sub-zero air pouring in, and the wind so loud that radio transmissions were inaudible. Worse still, Lancaster's body remained jammed against the controls, making it nearly impossible to stabilize the aircraft. 2 more flight attendants soon rushed in to help. One looped her arm through a seatbelt, allowing Ogden to reposition Lancaster's legs clear of the flight controls. Freed from this obstruction, Aitchison finally managed to pull the DC-9 out of its steep dive. He leveled off just long enough to descend into an altitude band where passengers could breathe without oxygen masks. Even then, danger lingered. The jet had blundered through crowded airspace, narrowly avoiding collisions, and Lancaster himself remained in peril. If he slipped free, he would not only be lost but could also be sucked into the engine, threatening everyone on board. Thinking quickly, another flight attendant lashed his legs to a jump seat, securing him in place. Though they could not bring him back inside, they could at least prevent him from being carried away. With the aircraft at last stable, Aitchison began to hear faint radio transmissions. He declared an emergency and requested the nearest possible diversion. Air traffic control directed him to Southampton Airport, a field where he had never landed before, but now his only option. Though under enormous pressure, Aitchison remained calm, worked closely with controllers, and against all odds executed a near-perfect landing at Southampton. Rescue teams were already waiting as Flight 5390 touched down. The shaken passengers were quickly escorted from the aircraft, while medical personnel and crew members hauled Captain Lancaster back into the cockpit and began resuscitation efforts. At that moment, most assumed he was beyond saving. His ordeal had been too severe. Yet, against all expectation, he was alive. Lancaster had suffered multiple fractures, countless lacerations, and severe frostbite across much of his body. Even so, within only a few days, he was speaking to the press from his hospital bed. With the immediate crisis over, investigators turned to the question that now demanded an answer: what had caused the cockpit window to detach in midair? The missing pane was recovered in a field in Oxfordshire, and both it and the aircraft were examined in detail. The truth emerged quickly. The windshield had been secured with bolts of the wrong size. Roughly 90 bolts had been used in the most recent maintenance, of which 84 were smaller than required. The difference between the installed bolts and the correct specification was less than the width of a credit card, a discrepancy that would have been nearly impossible to notice without painstaking inspection. So how had such a mistake occurred? Attention focused on the maintenance engineer who had replaced the window. Questioning revealed a chain of small but critical errors. When the aircraft came under his care, the windshield was already fastened with incorrect bolts. Instead of consulting the technical manual, he simply chose to install replacements that looked the same. He relied on a visual comparison between old and new bolts, never cross-checking part numbers. As a result, he replaced one set of incorrect bolts with another set that was equally unfit. He ignored written guidance, brushed aside a colleague's advice, and no second inspection was carried out when the work was finished. Though the new bolts appeared nearly identical, even the smallest differences in length and width created a fatal weakness that all but guaranteed failure. In the aftermath, British Airways tightened its engineering protocols, and the incident became a case study for mechanics across the aviation industry. Every aircraft of the same type was inspected, and at least 2 others were found to have windscreens installed with bolts of the wrong size. Story 4. The Tenerife Airport Disaster. On the 27th of March, 1977, one of the deadliest catastrophes in aviation history unfolded at Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife. 2 fully loaded Boeing 747s collided on the runway, producing a tragedy without precedent, one that was ultimately traced to nothing more than a series of communication errors. The day of the disaster was an unusually busy one at Los Rodeos. Normally, the small island airport operated with a single runway and a single parallel taxiway, handling only a modest number of flights and rarely accommodating aircraft of such size. But on that day, chaos descended after multiple inbound flights were diverted from Gando Airport on nearby Gran Canaria, which had been closed following the detonation of a small bomb inside a terminal flower shop. Among the diverted flights were KLM 4805 from Amsterdam and Pan American 1736 from Los Angeles. Both had been bound for Gran Canaria but were forced instead to land at Los Rodeos. The situation quickly grew untenable. The taxiways became so congested with parked aircraft that there was no space left for movement. As a result, every departing plane was forced to taxi along the runway itself, adding dangerous complexity for the small control tower staff, who were accustomed to managing only a handful of operations at a time. Compounding matters, it was a Sunday, and only 2 controllers were on duty. With no ground radar available, they relied entirely on line of sight and radio communications. As the day wore on, a dense fog descended, further obscuring visibility. Controllers could no longer see the aircraft they were directing, and pilots could barely make out the runway or signage beneath them. Delays mounted as confusion deepened. For the passengers, the waiting was miserable. The cramped terminal offered little relief, and many were uncertain how long they would be stranded. Passengers aboard Pan Am 1736 remained stuck on their aircraft in stifling heat, as there was virtually no space left inside the terminal. By contrast, one woman traveling aboard the KLM flight was spared the ordeal altogether. A Tenerife resident, she disembarked when the flight first landed, choosing to go home rather than sit through the delay, an ordinary decision that, unbeknownst to her, saved her life. For the majority, however, most of them tourists, there was no choice but to wait. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, word finally came that Gran Canaria had been declared safe and reopened. Passengers reboarded, crews prepared for departure, and as the traffic jam began to ease, the KLM aircraft was instructed to taxi to the far end of the runway in preparation for takeoff. At the same time, the Pan Am flight was directed to follow the runway and exit via the 3rd taxiway. But that was easier said than done. In the thick fog and unfamiliar environment, the Pan Am crew missed the assigned exit and continued crawling toward the 4th. What this meant, in stark terms, was that the 2 massive Boeing 747s were now aligned nose to nose on the same stretch of tarmac, separated only by a wall of fog. At the far end, the KLM aircraft stood ready to begin its takeoff roll. At the near end, the Pan Am aircraft continued lumbering forward in search of its exit. From the cockpit of the KLM jet, Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten strained his eyes into the blinding white fog. Concerned that the crew's duty hours were about to exceed regulations, Captain van Zanten grew impatient to depart. He even released the brakes, allowing the aircraft to begin rolling forward without clearance from the tower. At that moment, the first officer quickly reminded him that they had not yet been given permission to take off. Van Zanten reluctantly stopped and remarked, "No, I know. Keep going. Ask." The first officer radioed air traffic control. The controller responded with instructions describing the route the KLM would take after departure, but critically, no clearance to take off was granted. The first officer repeated the instructions back, ending with the phrase, "We are now at takeoff." The tower replied, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." At that very instant, the Pan Am aircraft, still taxiing down the runway, cut into the transmission to remind the tower that they had not yet vacated. The 2 radio signals overlapped, creating interference that garbled most of the exchange, leaving only one word audible, "Okay." That single word was all that reached the KLM cockpit, and Captain Van Zanten misinterpreted it as clearance to depart. He advanced the throttles, and the jet surged down the runway. Even as the aircraft gathered speed, hesitation lingered on the flight deck. The flight engineer spoke up, questioning the captain. "Are you sure Pan American is clear of the runway?" Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten replied curtly, "Yes," and pressed on with the takeoff roll. If the others harbored doubts, none voiced them. Van Zanten was a veteran with more than 10,000 flight hours, and no one on the crew wished to challenge his authority as the massive jet accelerated into the fog. The Pan American pilots caught sight of the KLM hurtling toward them only moments before impact. They managed to swerve partially, but the collision could not be avoided. For his part, Van Zanten attempted an early liftoff, hoping to clear the Pan Am, but the maneuver failed. The KLM plowed into the Pan American jet, then crashed back onto the runway, exploding into a colossal fireball. The Pan Am also erupted in flames, though 61 people managed to survive, many by leaping from the wings, suffering terrible injuries in the process. In this disaster, survivors were the exception, not the rule. 583 lives were lost, including everyone aboard the KLM flight. The inferno raged across the runway for hours before it was finally subdued. In the aftermath, multiple investigations were launched, all of which concluded that human factors had been decisive. Captain Van Zanten's impatience, combined with the crew's reluctance to challenge him, was compounded by miscommunication over the radio. In the end, KLM accepted responsibility and compensated the families of the victims. One of the most significant reforms following the tragedy was the standardization of aviation phraseology. Ambiguous terms, such as "okay," were banned. Instead, clear, precise readbacks became mandatory, and the word takeoff was prohibited unless explicit clearance to depart had been issued. Cockpit hierarchy was also restructured. The industry began promoting a collaborative environment in which first officers and flight engineers were not only permitted but required to speak up when something seemed amiss, and captains were obligated to listen and respond to those concerns. In the years that followed, memorials were erected around the world in honor of the victims. The tragedy erased entire families, tore friendships apart, and shattered countless peaceful lives in an instant. And all of it need never have happened if not for a few impatient seconds and a single garbled radio call. If you found this video compelling, be sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories. And don't forget to share your thoughts with us in the comments below.